Rebel forces have captured Aleppo and Hama, two of Syria's largest cities, from the regime in their biggest offensive in years.
But who are they? Who is fighting who? And will this new offensive spark another round of intense conflict in Syria? Here is everything you need to know.
In just a few hours, a coalition of rebel groups, some backed by Turkey while mostly led by jihadist fighters Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, known as HTS, launched a lightning offensive where they seized control of territory that Bashar al-Assad's regime had spent years annihilating. In response, the Syrian regime and its ally Russia bombed the area, killing hundreds of the rebels and civilians, while Iranian-backed Iraqi militias have deployed in Syria to back the government's counter-offensive.
Who are Hayat Tahrir al-Sham?
Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, previously known as Jabhat al-Nusra or Al-Nusra Front, is a militant group fighting against the Syrian regime. They had declared allegiance to Al-Qaeda, but publicly broke these ties in 2016 and fought ISIS, renouncing transnational jihadism to focus on state building in the territories that it took over. They rebranded as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. The group is designated as a terrorist organization by the US, the UN, and others. They are now the most powerful rebel faction in Syria and control Idlib province, where about 4 million people live, and they are said to have around 30,000 troops.
Why now? Why did the rebels choose this moment to launch a new offensive?
President Assad once looked like he might be toppled by the diverse group of rebels that rose up against him after the Arab Spring. But he survived largely because of the intervention of Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah, Iran's Lebanon-based proxy.
There's a very wide coalition of armed groups involved here, have been planning this offensive for several months. In fact, it was meant to start in mid-October. At that point, the Turkish intelligence agency actually discovered these plans and put a stop to it. So, of course, it's interesting that it has happened, nevertheless, several weeks later.
The US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has put the rebels' advances down to other regional events.
Although Russia has launched airstrikes against the rebel offensive, its urgent priority is now the war in Ukraine, where it's been bogged down in a 4-year-long attritional war that it thought it could win in just 2 weeks. Vladimir Putin eliminated the role of mercenary Wagner Group in Syria following its mutiny in Russia a year ago and removed some of its most advanced air defense platforms from Syria. Iran and Hezbollah, once Assad's most reliable allies, are also grappling with significant challenges. Iran's hegemony in the region has been diminished under the Israeli air campaign that has reduced its military capabilities.
חיזבאללה בחר לתקוף אותנו משם ב-8 באוקטובר. חלפה שנה. זה כבר לא אותו חיזבאללה. החזרנו אותו עשרות שנים אחורה. חיסלנו את נסראללה, זה הציר של הציר. חיסלנו את כל בכירי הארגון. השמדנו את מרבית הטילים והרקטות שלו. חיסלנו אלפי מחבלים. והשמדנו את תשתיות התת-קרקע והטרור שסמוכות לגבולנו.
While Hezbollah, Iran's proxy and funnel for weapons, has had its leadership wiped out and lacks the capacity to redeploy forces to Syria in large numbers.
رژیم صهیونیستی به صورت فعال حمایت می‌کرده از گروه‌های مختلف تروریستی. هدف هم روشن هست، هدف هم تضعیف مقاومت و سوریه به عنوان یکی از محورهای اصلی مقاومت در برابر اشغالگری و هم به عنوان روشی دیرپا از سوی رژیم صهیونیستی برای ناهمسازی کل منطقه، برای ایجاد تفرقه و فتنه در بین گروه‌ها و کشورهای مختلف اسلامی است.
The Kremlin spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, said that Russia also considered the situation around Aleppo as an attack on Syrian sovereignty, and that it was in favor of the Syrian authorities bringing order to the area and restoring constitutional order as soon as possible.
But whether Assad's guarantors can ensure the regime's survival, well, that remains to be seen. But why are Russia and Iran so critical to Syria?
Amid the uprisings of the Arab Spring from 2010 and 11, where a wave of popular pro-democracy protests rapidly spread across the Middle East and North Africa, a dozen teenagers tagged the wall of their school in southern Syria, "Your turn, doctor," referring to Bashar al-Assad, who had studied to be an eye surgeon. The torture of the students sparked nationwide protests and calls for democratic reform against a family that has held power in Syria for over 40 years.
A significant proportion, if not a substantial majority of Syrians did rise up peacefully in early 2011, initially to call for political reforms. As the regime cracked down as brutally as it did, that did swiftly become more of a militarized uprising. But what we've seen over the past nearly 14 years is that the regime takes a no-holds-barred approach to cracking down on any opposition. We've had more than 340 chemical weapons attacks confirmed between 2012 and 2016, 82,000 barrel bombs, ballistic missiles, you name it. Everything has been thrown at the Syrian people to prevent them from continuing to rise up.
The conflict quickly escalated when the regime violently suppressed peaceful protests. Some of the opposition gradually took up arms. In 2015, with the Assad regime believed to be facing collapse, Russia intervened with diplomatic, economic, and military support. It evolved into a full-scale war between the Syrian government, backed by Russia and Iran, and anti-government rebel groups backed by the United States and a rotating number of US allies, including France, the United Kingdom, Italy, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Jordan, and the United Arab Emirates. The rise of extremist groups like ISIS, staking territory in Syria, and renewed conflict in neighboring Iraq further complicated the situation. 3 campaigns drive the conflict: the coalition efforts to defeat Islamic State, violence between the Syrian government and opposition forces, and military operations against Syrian Kurds by Turkish forces. Over 13 years, the war has caused immense human suffering, with more than 500,000 people killed, 7 million displaced, and a long-lasting humanitarian crisis.
Despite the recapture of much of the country, the conflict remains unresolved and has largely been out of the headlines. How have Western powers and neighbouring Turkey responded? The US, UK, France and Germany, all of which are opposed to Assad's regime, issued a joint statement urging immediate de-escalation.
They also called for a Syrian-led political solution to the conflict, as outlined in a 2015 UN Security Council resolution.
The US has been cautious.
It has around 900 troops deployed in Syria, with another 2,500 in Iraq that are part of a coalition to prevent ISIS from regrouping. The Biden administration's approach to Syria, continuing the legacy of the Barack Obama administration, considered widely as having failed and fueled the conflict today, is designed around ensuring that Islamic State doesn't return and that its key ally, Israel, is protected. That might change after President-elect Donald Trump takes office in January. Trump has twice threatened to withdraw these troops during his first term. The dramatic rebel advance has also put a renewed spotlight on Turkey's role in Syria. Turkey, a NATO ally, has carried out ground operations to expel Kurdish forces from parts of Syria's northern border since 2016. It has sought to normalize ties with Assad in order to address security threats on its border from Kurdish militias and to ensure the conditions for the return of more than 3 million Syrian refugees that it hosts, which has strained its economy and fueled domestic political tensions. But these efforts have fallen flat.
Biz bu konulardaki uyarılarımızı ilgili tüm taraflara defalarca yapmıştık. Son gelişmeler Şam'ın kendi halkıyla ve meşru muhalefetle uzlaşı sağlaması gerektiğini bir kez daha gösteriyor. Türkiye bu yönde gereken tüm katkıyı sağlamaya hazırdır.
Turkey has neither confirmed nor denied its support for HTS. But Turkish-backed militias fought alongside HTS in the offensive, and the timing of the attack, given the regional distractions, suggests coordination with Turkey's strategic goals. President Erdogan could stand to benefit from a weakened Assad regime and the power vacuum left by Iranian influence.
So what might happen next?
The new surge in fighting has raised the prospect of another violent front reopening in the Middle East at a time when US-backed Israel is fighting Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon, both Iranian-allied groups. Turkey, Russia and Iran have appeared to agree on the need to convene an urgent meeting to discuss Syria's political future as part of the Astana process that's been ongoing since January 2017. The three have met 22 times since.
The humanitarian crisis in Syria is worse today than it has ever been, which after 4 years of quote-unquote frozen conflict, I think sort of speaks for itself. With war and conflicts raging elsewhere in Ukraine, in Gaza, in Lebanon, the international community has also significantly reduced its humanitarian assistance to the Syrian crisis. So the needs are higher than ever, but our willingness to support those needs is so low that only 25% of the aid need is currently being met.
The rebels' capture of the cities of Aleppo and Hama signal a new phase in this long-running civil war. And it could have serious consequences, not just for Syria, but the wider region.